Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Leah and Mia for inviting me to Ljubljana. This is my first time in Ljubljana. And thank you for arranging the weather as well to be so nice. As someone who's British, I have an unhealthy obsession with the weather. So it's been very nice. Okay, so the paper then, I hope, will speak to the theme of the series concerning productivity and the critique of accelerationism. Adorno writes in the dedication of Minima Moralia that life has become, quote, dragged along as an appendage of the process of material production. Life is only now visible in its estranged form as the determination of life by production inverts the true relation between them. It is only by opposing production that an order worthy of human beings can be achieved. If life should be effaced, then, quote, the monstrosity of absolute production will triumph. In contrast, we could suggest that contemporary partisans of accelerationism reject exactly this premise of the monstrosity of absolute production. One thing which unifies the various strands of accelerationism, left and right, is a stress on production, on retooling or engaging with the possibilities of production. Accelerationism can be defined as an intervention that works with capitalist forms of abstraction and technology to exacerbate or subvert these forms from within. It is, we might say, a new productivism, and references to the Soviet avant-garde abound in discussions of accelerationism, both negative and positive. From Gastev and Prolakov to Bogdanov and Russian futurism, the utopian dreams of the avant-garde exert a fascination for a time which had faith in the possibilities and capacities of production. I want to consider the debate around accelerationism, if that's what it is, as a debate about the productive forces. The faith of accelerationism is a faith in the productive forces, in the fidelity to a certain Marx, and in fidelity to the possibilities of those forces to be reformed or revolutionised. It is this faith I want to critique by placing accelerationism in contact with a series of debates and confrontations with the notion of the productive forces. This is because often the debate around accelerationism takes place as if much of this history had not happened, or offers a very selective history. If we are to grasp and critique accelerationism, then the reconstruction and critique of the productive forces is a crucial gesture. I'm going to focus this intervention around the question of the machine as the site of alienated objectification, and I want to link this to the related problem of noise and sound, the monstrous noises of industry and production, and the aesthetic and political attempts to convert these into accessible sounds. As I think I've probably said before, one thing that I think can be said about accelerationism is that its aesthetics is primarily an aesthetics of sound or music. In fact. So, to begin with Marx. Marx, in his work of the 1840s, defines the productive forces as the objectifications of human powers, in concert with a work on and through nature. Under capitalism, these objectified powers are subject to alienation, so the task must be to repossess these powers to lead us back to the objectified powers of humans. In the 1844 manuscripts, he writes, "It can be seen how the history of industry and the objective existence of industry as it has developed is the open book of the essential powers of man." Marx aims to make this book legible, to return us to the capacity to read in industry our own powers. Humans have been, quote, moving in the realm of estrangement, and so are not able to grasp the reality of man's essential powers as man's species activity. Marx moves between the concepts of objectification and alienation to delineate a critique of alienation and the recovery of essential powers through a sustained control over objectification. Contrary to some images of Marx, this return always involves sustaining objectification, not simply abolishing it in return to some presence and the metaphysics of the subject. De-alienation rests on objectification, but in making that objectification legible and accessible. Similarly, in his polemic with Proudhon, Marx will sustain the argument that, quote, every productive force is an acquired force, the product of former activity. Marx continues in a quote that's reminiscent of the 18th Brumaire: "The productive forces are therefore the result of practically applied human energy. But this energy is itself conditioned by the circumstances in which men find themselves, by the productive forces already acquired, by the social form which exists before they exist, which they do not create, which is the product of the preceding generation. The productive forces are inherited conditions, our creations, which do, however, weigh on us. This problem of the inheritance of the productive forces will become a crucial stake of the debate." Marx is also insistent, contrary to Proudhon's vision, that history proceeds by the bad side. This process of inheritance and creation is not neutral or happy. No antagonism, no progress, Marx says. In particular, Marx stresses that, quote, "Till now the productive forces have been developed by virtue of this system of class antagonisms. Class antagonism is the driver of history and the development of the productive forces, a development which displays a profoundly uneven and class-determined character." Marx sarcastically notes of claims to worker satisfaction that, quote, "It is like saying that because under the Roman emperors, Murena," which are these large eels, you can see here. Oh, that's like this quote. "Murena, a large eel, were fattened in artificial fish ponds. Therefore, there was enough to abundantly feed the whole Roman population. Actually, on the contrary, the Roman people had not enough to buy bread with, while the Roman aristocrats had slaves enough to throw as fodder to the Murena. Access to the fruits of development is profoundly uneven, especially in a capitalist society where wealth for some means poverty for most. Therefore, development is not a smooth and linear form of progress, but a violently uneven and contested process." There is, however, some tension in this argument, in particular with Marx's later statement in the 1859 preface. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. This seems to present a mechanical vision of the development of the productive forces that now appear autonomous to humanity, at odds with Marx's previous argument. These forces, regarded as neutral, now appear only held back, fettered, by relations that will themselves collapse under the pressure of those forces. It is the conception outlined in the 1859 preface that seems to me to be the one of the crucial figures of Marx for the currents of accelerationism. This is why I've called accelerationists heretics of Marx, and also because that's a reference to Frank Herbert's Heretics of June. So I like June. Faith in the productive forces teeters dangerously into supposing the neutrality of those forces and the simplicity of their reconfiguration and reuse. The model of fetters implies a bursting of limits that drives an accelerationist image of revolution. Marx provides a dual legacy, torn or divided between class struggle and development, which he holds together dialectically, but which has become split apart. It's the machine, both actual and figural, which was the site of the debate concerning the productive forces. Marx in Capital noted that it is with the machine that alienation and inversion is fully achieved. The automaton, as he puts it, is the shape of capital, of dead labour, that dominates and pumps dry living labour power. The reactionary German romantic Adam Müller wrote in 1816, "Man needs a many-sided, even an all-rounded sphere for his activity, limited and restricted as this activity itself may be. But if the division of labour, as it is now being practised in the big cities and the manufacturing and mining areas, cuts up free man into wheels, cogs, cylinders and shuttles, imposes on him one sphere of activity in the course of his many-sided search for one object, how can one expect this segmented segment to be adequate to the full and fulfilled life of right and law?" Here the machine is a device of fragmentation and segmentation, a figure of the division of labour that reduces or divides humans into a mimesis of the machine. This is, in the case of Muller, a reactionary romanticism driven by a desire to return to unity, to wholeness, to a mythical past, a movement that Marx will definitively reject. Instead, I want to turn to currents of radical romanticism as ways of thinking the tension between forms of struggle and the machine that do not simply concede to a nostalgia for a past unity. In particular, I will focus on the British poet, engraver and radical William Blake. William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience of 1794 offers a dialectic between these two contrary states of the human soul, as he puts it. It is particularly the Songs of Experience that offer a reflection on the forging of the human soul out of a series of productive processes. In fact, Serima argues that Blake is the poet of production, whose work is dominated by processes of making. Quote, think of all those hammers, anvils, bellows, tongs. Think of all the measuring, stretching, pulling, cutting, fracturing, compassing. Blake develops a capacious model of life as production, of life as ontological production, in which life is both tied to capitalist production and can rupture with it. So for Blake, human powers are subject to the violent division and fragmentation of the forces of what he calls the ratio, which includes science, philosophy, and the forms of capitalist labour. This is evident in Blake's poem London from the Songs of Experience. So the two poems I'll briefly talk about are London and The Tiger, which Blake wrote both about the same time, actually, which I found recently. On his manuscript book here, they're actually both on the same page, so he wrote both together. So I just want to talk briefly about the start of London, which begins, I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Chartered, in this context, refers to the power of charters and corporations to dictate the flow of humans through streets, and of nature in the form of the River Thames. So we could translate this into contemporary parlance as I wander through each corporate street, near where the corporate Thames does flow. We witness here the enclosure of life, of its containment, separation and subjection to the forces of capitalist production in marks of weakness, marks of woe. This form of enclosure reaches into the soul of the individual. In the mind-forged manacles, Blake sees as chaining the psyche. Unlike the reactionary romantic anti-capitalists, Blake does not simply decry the imposition of the ratio. Blake's work is not simply nostalgic for some prior state of innocence, but concerned with forging a dialectic between innocence and experience. This is evident in Blake's The Tiger. The tiger is the tiger of wrath, wiser than the horses of instruction. I know one thing I've noticed about Ljubljana is you do like your graffiti, to the point where there is a graffiti tour on offer. I was not tourist enough to do it, but this is some graffiti from 70s London by a situationist group. It's a quote from Blake. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. So Blake's The Tiger is a tiger of wrath who incarnates a primal energy and violence. This force is beyond the ratio. So as it begins, tiger, tiger burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Symmetry here exceeds the geometric powers of the ratio. The violent force of the tiger is also the force of the revolutionary mob. The poems were written between 1789 and 1794. The French people, according to the London Times of January 7th, 1792, had become, quote, more ferocious than wolves and tigers. This insurgent force of the mob is a force that is forged. It is not purely natural or excessive, an abstract potentiality, but one that emerges through industrial processes. To quote this verse here. What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain, what the anvil, what dead grasp, dare its deadly terrors clasp. For J.H. Prynne, contemporary British poet, the tiger seems created from burning and hammering. Prynne reads the poem as a metaphor of the blast furnace, dependent for its fuel, charcoal, on the forest of the night the tiger emerges from. For Prynne, Blake's poem is one of violent metallurgy, hammering out and smelting signifiers to create a new image of production. In particular, Prynne suggests Blake's active working outlook was in these terms profoundly ambivalent and transitional. To tap energy and to break free required the directed battery of the individual metal forger's hammer. Perry Anderson remarks that Blake had, quote, an acute feel for dialectical opposition, but much less for surpassal or synthesis. Against this, I'd suggest here the tiger is synthesised, both with industrial processes and with his contrary, the lamb, which is why critics have conjectured the tiger looks so benign. So if you look, it's a rather sweet-looking tiger. I can't go into whole Blake's metaphysics, but this is because it's synthesised with the Christian lamb. Blake conceived his own image-making and poetry, so these engravings are all obviously Blake's own work, as violent processes of making. As he said, by printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. In the case of the tiger, David Erdman makes explicit the cosmopolitical stakes of Blake's vision. The creative blacksmith who seizes the molten stuff of terror, the terror of revolution, and shapes it into living form on the cosmic anvil must employ dread power as well as daring and art. But the dread, Blake hopes, will be sufficient unto the day. The climax of the forging is a mighty hammering, which drives out the impurities in a shower of sparks, like the falling stars children call angels' tears. Hammering is not only the hammering of the industrial worker into machine shapes, the forging of humans into segmented segments, but also the dialectic that forges an insurgent force that exercises deadly terrors against the ratio. Blake creates a dialectic between class struggle and the productive forces, a synthesis of violent making and unmaking. Robert Essick remarks that Blake may be our noisiest poet. It is this noise, linked as it is to the industrial or proto-industrial processes, that I want to trace as a figure for the productive forces. The factory and other sites of production are also obviously sites of excessive noise. The sounds of production are sounds made in concert between humans and the materials they are transforming in acts of violence and appropriation. Already in Blake, we find this noise of production as a sign of the forging of new forces. What we will witness is the attempt to engage with these noises, to form sounds out of them, to make it possible to hear something of the violent struggles encrypted in machine noise. Marx in Capital remarks on how Capital defied the very definition of day and night, how Capital tried to extend day into night. And by this extension of the working day, as he put it, Capital was celebrating its orgies. Marx continued, as soon as the working class, stunned at first by the noise and turmoil of the new system of production, had recovered its senses to some extent, it began to offer resistance. The worker is stunned into quiescence, stunned by noise, but soon recovers their desire for resistance. Later, in chapter 15, Marx recurs to this oral violence. Every sense organ is injured by the artificially high temperatures, by the dust-laden atmosphere, by the deafening noise. Not to mention danger to life and limb among machines, which are so closely crowded together, a danger which, with the regularity of the seasons, produces its list of those killed and wounded in the industrial battle. The noise disrupts the senses, destroys the worker's sensibility, and this is the sound of industrial battle. The class war as literal warfare, waged through capitalist assault. The Soviet avant-garde, especially with the invention of sound film, would make use of this sound of assault as its own weapon. Owen Hatherley has recently detailed how the filmmakers of the avant-garde tried to weaponize sound to inhabit the shock industrialization of the Soviet Union. He selects Vertov's Enthusiasm, 1931, particularly the scene in the steelworks, as an exemplary film of communist accelerationism. This is the furnace of the 5-year plan, which in true accelerationist fashion was completed in 4 years. Industrial labour as shock work and sensory overload, but in the service of building communism, or more exactly, Stalinism. Hatherley later analyses Podovkin's Deserter from 1933 with what Hatherley calls its transformation of industry into angular syncopations. These works stand unstably between the avant-garde and the embrace of Stalinism, between the dreams of Fordist and Taylorist mechanisation of the human and the human forces of the shock worker. This instability is figured in the violent use of noise and sound, the shock of labour transformed into the beating of a new industrial soundtrack. The tensions between the avant-garde mechanisation of the human and the shock worker storming production is exemplified in Andrei Platonov's The Foundation Pit of 1930. In the novel, on a collective farm, we encounter the unknown proletariat, a bear. The bear is hammering at a forge and growling some happy song. The bear has become inspired to become a shock worker by party slogans and hammers violently at iron, expending all his furious, speechless joy into the zeal of labour. The peasants of the collective are frightened that this violent, accelerated labour will destroy the molten iron. They shout, "Don't torment matter." Annie Eppelboyne argues that wanting to force open the doors of the future, he, the bear, threatens to return the world to primordial chaos. Wanting to force the pace, to accelerate time, he shows us that time is reversible. The violence of shock work, the attempt to punch through time, reverts matter and humanity to a primal state of chaos. Here, accelerationism, in the shock form, reverts to a hammering that torments matter, that strikes not for the future, but to a regression that reverts us to a pre-industrial sense of the cosmic forging of matter. Platonov's acute reading suggests the legibility of the book of industry can become an illegible chaos and violence, a hammering that does not hammer out the future, but which becomes a hammering into destruction. The very attempt to master and control production unleashes a destructive effect that shatters development into regression. These attempts to inhabit and exceed the noise of industrial production into new forms of sound prefigure later forms of accelerationism. This negotiation will, however, become more and more fraught with the extending and deepening triumph of capitalism. Jean-Luc Godard's British Sounds, 1969, his film, one down. Godard's British Sounds begins with the extreme noise of the car production line at Ford in Dagenham, not far from where I was born, with the British sounds of the whine of drills, of shouting, hammering, sawing and banging. This industrial noise could still form the basis for the invocation of the spectre of communism haunting Britain in Godard's soundtrack, which could be made legible not in images, crossed out, not British images, British sounds, not in images but in sounds, and in the interviews that Godard conducted with the workers on the production line. Here there are competing sounds, the din of industrial production that threatens to drown out the sound of class struggle, which Godard's film tries to render as audible. This is a production line image. It would take Jean-Francois Lyotard to push things to maximum ambiguity. Lyotard's notorious statement in Libidinal Economy of 1974 might well be the signature accelerationist statement, even more so than Deleuze and Guattari's famous statement about accelerating the process from Anti-Oedipus, which is the one everyone, including me, tends to quote. I think the Lyotard one is probably more provocative. put it mildly. So this is Lyotard. The English unemployed did not become workers to survive. They hang on tight and spit on me, enjoyed the hysterical, masochistic, whatever exhaustion it was, of hanging on in the mines, in the foundries, in the factories, in hell. They enjoyed it. Enjoyed the mad destruction of their organic body, which was indeed imposed upon them. They enjoyed the decomposition of their personal identity, the identity that the peasant tradition had constructed for them, enjoyed the dissolution of their families and villages, and enjoyed the new monstrous anonymity of the suburbs and the pubs in morning and evening. While it's easy to remain focused on this deliberately scandalous statement, I want to move on to consider how Lyotard unpacks this experience of jouissance. The enjoyment of the worker in the hell of the factory is likened by Lyotard to that of prostitution, an experience of repetition of the body in service to production. This violent repetition, according to Lyotard, results in hysterical anaesthetization, to absorb and live the trauma of that repetition. Lyotard's example is the worker's ear. He draws on research by Dr. Alfred A. Tomatz, who studied a worker who sat next to an alternator functioning at 20,000 hertz. The worker could not hear this sound. This, according to Lyotard, is the hysterical treatment of a fraction of the auditory body. For Lyotard, the worker has created a new libidinal assemblage, a new intensity, rather than this being a scene of violence and injury. Lyotard would later write that, quote, "The point was to convey that there is in the hardest working class condition an impressive contribution that easily matches and perhaps exceeds the adventures of poets, painters, musicians, mathematicians, physicists, and the boldest tinkerers and tamperers. The result was a body that was demeasured beyond the tolerance of the human and inhuman body. A new sensibility, as Lyotard put it. So the workers were not victims, but had developed a new mechanical asceticism." Lyotard retains from his previous commitment to radical communism, in his role in the group Socialism or Barbarism, a refusal to condescend to the worker as victim. He also retains a suspicion of socialism as a palliative that relies on the suffering of the worker to make moral and political claims of restitution. Now, however, these commitments take on the hue of capitalist apologetics. Industrial battle is drowned out by industrial immersion. And it's Lyotard, I think, who is the signature figure who will directly inspire the British accelerationists of the 1990s and still, in some ways, the accelerationists of the present. The contemporary iterations of accelerationism turn to the post-industrial. They intensify Lyotard's logic of immersion into an abandonment of any real reference to the worker. Nick Land, the leading 1990s philosopher of accelerationism, along with his allies in the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, states in a 1995 text, Meet, that, quote, "impending human extinction becomes accessible as a dance floor. It would be the sounds of electronic dance music which were to provide the figural and aesthetic form of accelerationism. This involves a reference to the industrial, but in the mode of surpassing it for a new accelerated space of consumption. The original formulation of Detroit techno had involved a deliberate erasing of the traces of the industrial. In the formulation of Magic Juan Atkins, one of the three founders of techno, the originator, as he's known, today the automobile plants use robots and computers to make their cars. I'm more interested in Ford's robots than Gordy's music. The reference is obviously to Berry Gordy and Motown. Gordy had actually worked as an automotive worker in Detroit, and his label was founded on Fordist principles of the production line, a range of interchangeable artists called on to perform at will. This is literally visible in the Martha and Vandellas promotional film for Nowhere to Run, which is an image from behind me, which I suggest you look at on YouTube. This promotional film was made on the Ford production line in 1965. It's a very strange film. It shows the group dancing through the Ford paint shop and factory, being oogled, as you can see, or studiously ignored by the predominantly African-American workers. Detroit techno would offer a utopian imaginary that registered the disappearance of work and the crisis of Detroit. but vectored this into an acceleration into a science fiction future. It would remain a future tinged with melancholy and finally poised in registering the displacement of living labour by dead labour. This included a registration of this process at work in the making of the music, through new technologies of sampler, synthesizer and drum machine, in which one musician could generate the sound world. The tensions of these processes could also register in explicit politicisation, notably in the embrace of anonymity and guerrilla action by the group Underground Resistance. A track like Install the Ho Chi Minh Chip figures an electronic warfare that might emerge out of this crisis state. This reference would fade in the 1990s activation of accelerationism, which could only figure labour as meat grinder, as Nick Land put it. Here the surpassing of labour would be one which portrayed labour as absolute horror and stressed a machine logic of the embrace of the market. Industrial production was no longer a legible book of human powers. Now the market would be the legible site of mutagenic forces of transformation. In terms of music, they turned to jungle, the post-rave UK music which deployed sped-up breakbeats, notably the Amen break, often aggressive sampling and a bass-heavy sound to figure this state. This distinctive dance music subculture provided a metaphorics of acceleration, a particular dark space of dehumanisation, contrary to the sometimes neo-hippie presentation of rave culture, and a particular dynamics of suburban and urban space. So this is suburban-based records which were based in Romford, which is the very unglamorous part of the world which I'm from. So one of the interesting things about jungle is that it is not a singularly urban subculture, but a dully suburban subculture. In the words of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, jungle functions as a particle accelerator, seismic base frequencies engineering a cellular drone which immerses the body in intensity at the molecular level. So you can see the Deleuzian resonance. Jungle embodied what Alex Williams calls the Landian imaginary of apocalyptic paranoid euphoria. While industrial music had made reference to the collapse of industry in the West and the struggles to secure some kind of resistance to that, here the embrace was one of the market and accelerated disintegration. The darkness of certain forms of this music drove a post-humanism that welcomed a speculative inhabiting of the market, mirrored in the rapid mutation and turnover of musical forms and styles in the semi-legal and illegal spaces of club and rave. It would be the mutagenic possibilities of drugs, music, assemblages that replaced the industrial, but also almost as a palliative replacement for the shock of factory labour. The disappearance of this violent experience, or its relative disappearance and displacement, seemed to call for a replacement experience of extreme consumption that would push the body to the limit. The exhaustion of industrial labour was to be mimicked, even parodied, by the exhaustion of the consuming body, now returning to the speculative generation of value. This logic of exhaustion was already visible in various previous dance music subcultures. The Northern Soul movement, which is an image of the dance floor, as the name suggests, dominant in the north of the UK, began in the 1960s with the embrace of African American soul music. Motown and its competitors produced music with an industrial tempo, a driving rhythm that could sustain a dance floor. Working class youths, but especially boys and men, would use amphetamines, speed, to live an extended weekend of balletic dancing and constant hedonism. This involved the escape from the intensive regime of industrial production into an intensive labour of leisure. Marx had noted how capitalism tried to batter down the, quote, elastic natural barrier that was the human being, to stretch them on the rack of extended production. Now this elasticity was tested in the space of consumption and leisure, driven to a new limit of going without sleep and sustenance. And this subculture would have an influence on later electronic dance music subcultures of house and techno. The theorisations of 90s accelerationists were not so much interested in an accurate portrayal of the experiences of raves and clubs, as extrapolating an inhuman future of accelerated merging with the opaque forces of speculative finance, incarnated in a punk capitalism that retooled anti-socialist sentiment in the weaponized form of semi-legal or illegal entrepreneurship. This form of accelerationism reclaimed the Italian futurists' authoritarian strain, now vectored to integration with the market and with any state form willing to unleash the market, hence Mitland's turn to China. And now he lives in China. Appropriately. Objectified forms were not to be controlled or reintegrated, but rather were sites for the dissolution of the human in a will to extinction. In the more contemporary iterations of left forms of accelerationism, there's still a claim to the dance floor, but now to electronic dance music as figuration of inertia, collapse and dread. This is the sound of crisis, the grinding noise of capitalism coming to a halt. In Mark Fisher's words, Chicago's footwork was this speeded up ghetto house going around 150, 160 BPM. Figures quote, "the bad infinity of the animated GIF with its stuttering, frustrated temporality, its eerie sense of being caught in a time trap." While Alex Williams lays claims not to the productive forces, but to the forward-propelling energies embodied in the best of youth music, its post-human ingenuity, alien sonic vocabulary, and its manipulation of affect and impersonal design. So the divide in contemporary accelerationism is between stasis and acceleration, the figural impasse of the present. In these tense formulations, the present is a moment of stasis, the past a resource for reactivation, and energy is the force of dread that hangs over us. Labour is nullified, and the reactivations and retoolings turn on cybernetic forces that will operate autonomously. Hence, I think, weirdly I saw advertised as a parallel talk going on about big data and algorithms. Weirdly, the fascination for algorithms and high-frequency trading as an image of autonomous, productive force in contemporary accelerationism. The key vector for retooling, ironically, is not so much production, but money itself. For the right accelerationists, this retooling of money comes in the form of Bitcoin and other alternative currencies. For the left accelerationists, it comes in claims to universal basic income. The accelerationists of today illustrate the malaise they claim to answer. The fragmentation and sporadic forms of struggle, which now are uneasily poised on claims to the frayed remnants of social provision and ecstatic abandonment into an uncertain precarity. The productive forces, while being laid claim to, appear still as a malign noise, a stuttering nonsense, or some unheard of as yet promise of a new accelerative rhythm. These quasi-apocalyptic figurations, even when uttered in the sonorous tones of the think tank, leave us with little sense of the productive forces as sites and formations determined by class struggles. The detachment of these forces from human control, the malign appearance of dead labour, especially dead labour in crisis, takes the sublime form of an exteriority that confronts us and which determines us. It is this sense of exteriority which feeds the dream of simple reuse and redeployment, while at the same time rendering these forces inaccessible, illegible and inaudible. While faith is asserted in the breaking of fetters, faith is lost in the class struggle. It seems to me a theoretical task, which I've attempted to begin here, to make these forms of struggle legible and perhaps better audible in the din of the productive forces. Better today, perhaps even audible in the silence of these productive forces, displaced to new sites, rendered in new computerized and machinic forms, in which the quiet hum of the computer fan is often our experience of the sound of industrial battle. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Do we have any questions already? Oh, well,
Stunned.
Okay. I have perhaps a question. Something that I still found
in your lecture a bit ambiguous is regarding this precise relationship between economy and dance music.
Yes.
How synchronized exactly are they? Well, because I'm not an expert for history of dance music, but doesn't it appear that, well, are they like the rhythms, do they mirror each other, or does the music come a bit afterwards? As you said something like, well, industrial music comes after the post-Fordist turn, more or less, after the end of this proper strict Taylorist discipline. So it's more like a certain synchronized rhythm, or more like a nostalgia for the economy.
Yeah, I think it depends on which forms you're talking about. Definitely with, I mean, I'm not an expert on industrial music, I should say. Probably people in this audience are more. But I would definitely say with what I know of industrial music, its formation is an after effect of the crisis of Fordist production. So in the British Group Test Department, it kind of registers in the early 80s. They were heavily involved in working with the British miners during the miners' strike. They produced works around that. So it's this kind of not simple nostalgia, but also a kind of mode of defence of the industrial worker as a central figure. And somewhere in my bag I have a postcard of Lieback, a metal worker poster. But so I think for industrial, which emerges in the 80s, it's this kind of almost recovery of the experience that is disappearing, at least in the West, obviously, as a kind of aesthetic and a kind of intensification of that at the level of the aesthetic. The Detroit techno, which emerges in 84, 85, I think, not making a kind of base superstructure parallelism that much, but I am a bit. Why not? I think it's registering that transition of Detroit to the post-industrial. So Derek May, who's one of the great techno artists, says somewhere like in Britain you have the group New Order, which they loved. He said, our music is the new disorder. But what's kind of interesting is when you listen to the music, it doesn't sound disordered. It's a kind of crafted regularization, obviously based around samples and drum machines. So I think in the Detroit moment there's that registration of that collapse of Detroit. So already Derek May is saying, and this is in the mid-80s, we've got gunfights, kids in gangs, Detroit is already undergoing a social collapse. In fact, a friend of mine, Steve, who still lives in Detroit, would argue that the collapse began after the insurrection of '67, when National Guard were on the streets and there was warfare in Detroit. And then the result of that was white flight from central Detroit. So the abandonment of Detroit as a city by white Americans pushed this incipient crisis, then the crisis of the car industry in Detroit further intensified it. So already in Detroit techno, it's registering that collapse. But unlike industrial, there's no nostalgia. There's the registration of the post-industrial. If you think of Kraftwerk, the transition from man-machine to computer world. This transition of the different kind of registrations. In terms of jungle and drum and bass, I think it's probably more a kind of formal inventiveness around this speeding up of breakbeats. I think, it is a kind of British form, a kind of, I argued once it's like the British hip-hop. It takes that form and invents something new out of it. But it never kind of went much further than that. So I think there it's a kind of formal innovation. But for Nick Land and the CCIU, it's registering this speed up, this desire for acceleration. So I'm also tempted to argue, I don't know whether you've even encountered it, but the debates around accelerationism, it seems to me also a very British thing. Very much linked to a British, English/British concern with our quote-unquote decline as a power. And I say quote-unquote decline because it's there are actually interesting things that manufacturing in Britain doesn't actually decline. Obviously, it declines in percentage of workers, but it's still quite successful with fewer workers. But in Britain, there is a kind of lived ideology that we have declined as a world power, which obviously we have in some military sense, but and imperial sense, which is the real big thing. And we need to kind of recover energy and speed up. So one thing in Britain which we have done, which you may have encountered this, is claim subcultures as the good thing that we still do well, better than anyone else. So, there's a kind of, I think there's an interesting parallel here with the kind of accelerationists interested in jungle and this kind of fetishization of British subcultural inventiveness, which even runs into Alex Williams' argument. It's British music that's going to be invented. Discuss.
Any ideas? No?
All this is very new to me. I'm very unfamiliar with all. Thank you. All this is very new to me. I'm not someone who's ever known anything about music. But what you've said at the end, I think, brings something to my mind, which is a question of ideology and music. I think, especially if I think to the Slovenian group lineup, which is probably the only thing I can reference. I'm really bad with music. I would say that ideology was a big question for that particular group, especially in the 80s. But it is also now. So, trying to phrase my question would be this: how do you see this relationship between ideology and music? It seemed to me that towards the end you were almost implying that basically it is like linked to even, nostalgia for the empire or something like that. Could you say anything on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think think about it. I mean, I guess the nearest parallel, as far as I know, in the UK to that kind of explicit ideological reflection comes in the UK in what's called post-punk. So, I mean, personally, we can turn this into an argument about music, which I'm quite happy to. I don't personally like the Sex Pistols and the Clash very much. Still rock music. I'm much more interested in post-punk. But what post-punk did was try and work out some of these kinds of problems with, if you like, the kind of ideology of rock and the ideology of consumption and capitalist society, I think in more interesting ways than the Pistols and the Clash did with this, so the Pistols and the Clash have this dialectic of recuperation, we're independent and then we'll sign to a major label and then we'll moan about being signed to a major label. The post-punk bands tried to work out like how it would be to produce quote-unquote autonomously, still within a capitalist market, how they would sell their music, how they would function. Also, how they would critique rock music. So Subway Sect, who are a very interesting British band, they had a rule about no rock posturing on stage. There was no, with your guitar, there was no phallic posturing, and they would, dress in this sort of deliberately functional way, and I emphasise this. So I think in Britain the kind of debate about the ideological forms, which seems to me from, I don't know much about Liebeck, but seems to me from I know about Liebeck, comes through that moment more explicitly. I think what's, in a way, the kind of focus on dance music, I think is for the accelerations themselves, is just to focus on they want an image of acceleration. What is their kind of aesthetic to produce this sense of acceleration? So if you can't point to it in the real world, if the Soviet avant-garde could point to Ford, the production line as a model which could be recuperated, reverted to a communist model, you could point to new forms of production. Really the only form of speed up you've got, in some sense, is the computer itself. So I think that electronic dance music becomes this sort of site of figuration for acceleration as an ideological image. Nothing else is accelerating. We could discuss that, but this is our image of what could be acceleration. And in the accelerationist version, the version I'm critiquing, I think it's an ideology that presents itself as anti-ideological. It's the argument about getting to the kind of real, almost in a Lacanian sense. The real forces of production, the real forces of immersion, kind of dissolving. I call it this fantasy of the end of fantasy. Getting rid of these ideological questions, which I think is fundamentally a kind of a problematic, to put it mildly, anti-socialism, kind of questions that are raised politically. It's an anti-politics that presents itself through this. We can just work with these accelerated forces at its worst. And that's what I think is going on. So it's almost an ideology that is anti-ideological. If Lieback themselves are trying to kind of grapple with ideology, here the argument is kind of get out of ideology. What can we do almost practically? What can we do in the real? That, I think, is its appeal.
Yeah, I have another quick question related to that. In the end, you made this distinction between left accelerationism and right accelerationism, and how they both rely on money, on certain monetary political projects, right on Bitcoin and left on UTD. And it seems outside the common denominator here is antagonism to any sort of political subject. So could we describe accelerationism as a certain political expression of this certain impulse to get rid of the subject? So because if you have Bitcoin, it means you don't have a central banking political system. I guess that's the impulse for the right accelerationism. And similarly with UTD, it means you don't really need, it's a sort of leftist politics without collective decisions.
I think it's easy if you're a right accelerationist. Life is easy. In one sense, then life gets a bit trickier. But life is easy if you're a right-wing accelerationist, then there is only one subject, and that subject is capital.
Yeah.
There is only capitalism. And what you want is more capitalism. It gets difficult when what do you do about that? Because if capital is the super subject, which I think it is, dissolving all that solid melts into air, remaking the whole planetary ecology with us, obviously, bound to it, then what can you do to speed it up? Should do you have to even do anything? Why is there a requirement for your will to be involved here? So in a sense, the right accelerationist political project is kind of, like I say, a kind of dissolutionist one. You just go with the flow. Obviously, that doesn't leave you much to do, so it becomes this rather more toxic, how can we speed it up? So then it becomes like we want purer markets. It kind of folds into this neo-reactionary politics, which is what Nick Land's been doing, of purer market forms. So that's the fascination for Bitcoin. It is, like you say, trying to have capitalism without any of its fetters, without any of its hold-ups. So that is the kind of paradox of the right accelerationist project. And what's, to put it mildly, disturbing, is in the new reactionaries, obviously also takes on these incredibly racist forms. So although I'm not the world's biggest Deleuzian, what's interesting is in this kind of embrace of absolute deterritorialization, you get this reterritorialization around race. So you probably don't know about these people, luckily. But, they want to be kind of cyber entrepreneurial kings. As I always say, it's interesting in someone's political project where you think they want to be and where you might be. So if they want to be kings, that only really leaves serfs for the rest of us. So I'm suspicious. They want to be the kind of kings of these statelets that will run on these kind of Bitcoin. And also it's highly racialized. It's a very American project. And that becomes its supplementary re-territorialization. On the left, this was the criticism made of the accelerationist project. So the idea of the accelerationist project really was a kind of, a recovery of, which I have some points of agreement with, a recovery of a certain kind of socialism. A recovery of, which I do have some agreement with, the notion of planning, the notion of organisation of production, the kind of reclaiming of all those things which we had displaced. The question then became, for the left accelerationists, which everyone asked, not just me, is like, what is the subject of this? If the classical Marxist subject is the proletariat, in however its configuration, if Negri's subject is the multitude, if Badiou's subject is a kind of refiguration of the worker, we can go through the list. What is your subject? Who is going to be doing the accelerating in this? And it seems to me that there are two answers to this. One, which is my rather nasty answer, which is it becomes a kind of ideology or a belief system for a certain kind of fraction of people, interested in kind of technology. I call it a kind of postmodern Saint-Simonism. No longer the industrial worker, but no longer the craft worker, but now the kind of tech worker becomes your leading subject. So it kind of melds with those kind of cognitarian type arguments, or, which is even stranger in kind of Alex and Nick's recent book, Inventing the Future, it actually ends up dependent on exactly the same forces that, in the UK anyway, the sort of remnants of a left project are dependent on. Unions, the left of the Labour Party, those things. So the irony is that they end up being dependent on what everyone on the left is dependent on. So all the while they've been criticising unions and the left for not embracing technology and abstraction, at the same time when they say, like, how are we going to embrace technology and abstraction, it's like, well, we're going to need the unions, to kind of, do some stuff here. So you end up with this paradox whereby your new project ends up dependent on the old subjectivity. And this is where I think, the aesthetic becomes crucial, because the aesthetic is what provides the kind of sexy new image to what is fundamentally perhaps more, not dull, but, a more problematic kind of, problem project that's about hegemony, And the problem with that is, as if no one had tried the project of hegemony before. Particularly in the UK, where the Communist Party of Great Britain, this is from boring history, but the Communist Party of Great Britain in the UK explicitly, articulated itself as a Gramscian project of hegemony in a really, really problematic way. Because in the end, in the 1980s, the Communist Party of Great Britain was deeply antagonistic to the left of the Labour Party. Was deeply divided about the miners' strike, was antagonistic to Tony Benn and the Bennite wing of the Labour Party. So the irony was that you had a Communist Party that was actually more centrist than your Social Democratic Party. I think there's a great quote by Eric Hobsbawm that the worst day of his political life was the failure of Neil Kinnock to become elected. I think it was in 1992. And as Perry Anderson pointed out in a review of Eric Hobsbawm's biography, Eric Hobsbawm had lived through Kristallnacht. So when the worst day of your political life is not Kristallnacht, that's something strange.
Okay. Dobro, če ni več vprašanj, še par obvestil. Okay, kot rečeno, naslednji teden se ne vidimo, ker je konec letnika. Je pa par drugih dogodkov, začela se bo kinokatedra, torej kombo predavanja plus filmi. Prvič jutri ob 6. zvečer v kinoteki. Predvajana bo Matrica in predaval bo Jan Princelj. To je to za enkrat. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.